For 30 years, she had kept silent. For 3 entire decades, Sarah Mitchell had kept memories that could touch the hearts of millions of people locked away in her own soul. But today, at 62 years old, sitting in her small living room in Charlotte, North Carolina, she finally decided to speak. "I never wanted to draw attention to myself," she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of dedicated education and precious memories guarded like treasures. "But some stories are too big to die with us. And Steph's story, the story of the boy I met in 1995, that story needs to be told. Have you ever wondered what children who will one day change the world are like before they even know they have that power?" Sarah Mitchell, retired teacher from Myers Park Elementary School, was about to reveal secrets about Steph Curry that not even his family knew completely. It was possible to perceive that talking about those days still moved this woman deeply, who had dedicated 45 years of her life to teaching. Her hands trembled slightly as she leafed through an album of faded photographs, each image carrying memories that she had preserved like sacred relics. The gentle scent of chamomile tea hung in the air, mixed with the aroma of old books that filled every corner of her home. "Steph arrived in my 5th-grade class in September of 1995, she continued, a nostalgic smile illuminating her face as she touched a specific photo. He was small for his age, only 10 years old, but there was something in his eyes, something I had never seen before in a child. Something that touches deeply is when an educator speaks about a special student after decades. It was impossible not to feel that each word from Sarah carried the weight of a truth that had shaped her perspective on human potential throughout her entire life. The first thing that caught my attention wasn't his talent for basketball, she revealed, her voice gaining an intensity that made the air around seem denser with meaning. It was his generosity. In all my years of teaching, I had never seen a 10-year-old child behave the way Steph behaved. Robert Kim, retired neighbor who had joined the conversation by chance, remained in reverent silence while listening. How is it possible that some memories have the power to touch anyone's heart who hears them, even 3 decades later? Every day, Sarah continued, and now discreet tears glistened in her eyes. Every day Steph shared his snack. Not just sometimes, not just when he remembered. Every single day. There was a girl in our class, Emma, whose family was going through financial difficulties. She often came to school without lunch. Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's former colleague who had joined the conversation, nodded with recognition. She also remembered those days, that time when some families silently struggled to make the basics last until the end of the month. Steph noticed this on the second day of school, Sarah revealed, her voice now laden with an admiration that 3 decades had failed to diminish. And without anyone asking, without being guided by adults, he began sharing half of his snack with Emma. Every day, throughout the entire year. Naturally, this leads us to the moment that demonstrated the exceptional character of that 10-year-old child. Sarah paused, taking a deep breath, as if gathering courage to share something that touched her very deeply. But it wasn't just that, she continued, and there was urgency in her voice that made everyone pay complete attention. When I called Steph to talk about this, to thank him for his kindness, do you know what he told me? What's most impressive is how some people manage to demonstrate wisdom that transcends their chronological age. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if reliving that conversation that had happened 3 decades before. He told me, "Teacher Sarah, my dad always says that God gave us talents to help other people. I have lunch. Emma doesn't. It's that simple." Sarah paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. He was 10 years old. 10 years old. And he already understood something about purpose that many adults never learn. It was impossible not to feel that this revelation touched something universal about human goodness and how it can manifest from the earliest childhood. Lisa Rodriguez, local documentarian who had been invited to record that testimony, felt a shiver run down her spine. And the gratitude, Sarah continued, now with tears flowing freely down her face. My God, the gratitude of that child. Steph thanked me every day, not just at the end of the school year, not just on special occasions. Every day he would come to my desk before leaving and say, "Thank you for believing in me, Teacher Sarah." How many times in life do you meet someone who recognizes and verbalizes gratitude with such consistency? Amanda Foster, child psychologist who had been invited to comment on the emotional development demonstrated by these memories, was clearly touched by the emotional maturity described. I would ask him, "Steph, why do you thank me every day?" And do you know what he would answer? Sarah made a dramatic pause, allowing expectation to build. He would say, "Because when you look at me, I see that you see good things, and that makes me want to be even better." Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest transformations begin when a child feels that someone truly believes in their potential. Sarah touched Steph's childhood photo again, as if that image carried special energy. "And the leadership," she continued, her voice now carrying a mixture of maternal pride and professional admiration. Steph always helped classmates with difficulties, even being one of the smartest in the class. When another student struggled with math or reading, Steph immediately offered to help. Michelle Carter, former school principal who had joined the group, remembered those characteristics well. "Yes, I remember him. Even at 9, 10 years old, he had this natural ability to make others feel included and valued." But perhaps what impressed me most, Sarah said, and now there was a reverent quality in her voice that made everyone lean closer, was his dedication. While other children played during recess, Steph often stayed practicing shots alone at a small basket we had in the courtyard. It was possible to perceive that this memory carried something prophetic, as if Sarah already knew, even at that time, that she was observing someone who would redefine what it means to be excellent in basketball. "I remember a specific day," she continued. "It was drizzling lightly, and all the other children were inside the classroom playing. I looked out the window and saw Steph out there, alone, trying to make shots, even with the rain. When I asked why he wasn't inside with the others, he told me something I never forgot. What would you do if a 10-year-old child demonstrated determination that rivaled that of professional athletes?" Sarah smiled through tears, as if that memory was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. He said, "Teacher Sarah, the others can play because they're already good at what they do. I need to train more because I have a dream too big for my size." Sarah paused, allowing the depth of that declaration from a 10-year-old child to reverberate. That phrase haunted me for decades. Great things happen when no one is looking, and at that moment, everyone realized they were discovering how some of history's greatest transformations begin. With a child who dreams too big for their size, but never too big for their heart. "But that," Sarah said, her voice now carrying an intensity that made everyone realize she was preparing to reveal something even deeper, "that was just the beginning. Because what Steph faced off the courts, what he carried in his heart, that's what will really move you. But what happened next would change everything forever." Sarah Mitchell paused for a long moment, her hands delicately touching a photo where Steph appeared significantly smaller than his classmates. It was possible to perceive that she was preparing to share memories that touched her in a much deeper way. Memories that revealed not only the greatness of character of a child, but also the silent struggles that he faced. "You need to understand," she began, her voice now carrying a protective intensity that only truly dedicated educators can demonstrate. Steph was different, and unfortunately, children aren't always kind to those who are different. Have you ever wondered how some children manage to keep their goodness intact, even when the world around them seems to conspire to harden them? Rachel Kim, former colleague who had joined the conversation, nodded with painful recognition. She also remembered those difficult times for the boy who would one day become a legend. Steph suffered bullying, Sarah revealed, and now genuine tears rolled down her face. Not just occasionally, regularly. He was smaller than most boys, quieter than many, and his kindness was often interpreted as weakness by more aggressive peers. Nicole Martinez, educational psychologist who had specialized in school bullying, felt a familiar tightness in her chest. How is it possible that children so small already carry the capacity to cause so much suffering to one another? "I remember a specific day in October," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly with the emotion of the memory. 3 sixth-grade boys, all significantly larger than Steph, were mocking him in the courtyard. They called him basketball dwarf, said he would never be a player because he was too small to dream big. The scent of autumn seemed to penetrate the room through open windows, carrying with it the nostalgia of those school days that mixed innocence and cruelty in a way that only childhood can do. Daniel Patel, retired principal who had worked at the school during those years, remembered those incidents well. "But do you know what Steph's reaction was?" Sarah asked, and there was something in her voice that made everyone lean closer. "He didn't fight back. He didn't scream. He didn't go complain to adults. He simply stood there, listening to every cruel word, with tears in his eyes, but never responding with the same hostility. Something that touches deeply is when we witness emotional maturity in someone who should be just learning to tie their own shoes." Christopher Lee, school counselor from that time, had witnessed that scene and never managed to forget it completely. "When the boys finally walked away," Sarah continued, "I approached Steph. He was standing there, wiping tears, and I asked if he was okay. Do you know what he told me?" Naturally, this leads us to the moment that revealed a spiritual wisdom that completely transcended the age of that child. Sarah closed her eyes, as if channeling the voice of that 10-year-old boy through 3 decades of preserved memory. "He told me, 'Teacher Sarah, I'm praying for them to be happy. My dad taught me that when someone hurts other people, it's because they're suffering inside. So I pray for their pain to go away.'" Sarah paused, allowing the weight of that response to reverberate. He was 10 years old and was praying for the boys who bullied him. What would you do if a 10-year-old child demonstrated compassion that rivals that of saints and spiritual leaders? Ryan Johnson, local pastor who had joined the conversation, felt a lump in his throat. In decades of ministry, he had rarely encountered adults with such spiritual maturity. "But perhaps what moved me most," Sarah continued, "were the intimate conversations Steph had with me after difficult episodes. There were days when he stayed after class, helping to organize the room, and during these moments he opened up about his deepest feelings. It was possible to perceive that those conversations had deeply marked both the teacher and the student. Stephen Rodriguez, former school janitor who also remembered Steph well, had witnessed many of those silent moments of connection between educator and student. One day, Sarah revealed, her voice now laden with a vulnerability that touched anyone who had ever struggled with insecurities. Steph told me something I could never forget. He said, "Teacher Sarah, sometimes I feel like I'm too small for my dreams. Everyone says I should dream about smaller things, more suitable for my size." How is it possible for a child to articulate existential insecurities with such clarity? Matthew Brown, child psychologist who had specialized in self-esteem during development, recognized in Sarah's description a level of self-awareness rarely seen in children so young. But then, Sarah continued, and now there was a gleam of admiration in her eyes that 3 decades couldn't diminish. Steph told me something that proved his faith was greater than his fears. He said, "But I believe God didn't give me these dreams to torture me. He gave me these dreams because He knows something about me that I don't know yet." Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest revelations about character happen when a child expresses a faith that defies all physical evidence around them. Andrew Davis, theologian who studied spiritual development in children, was clearly touched by the depth of that declaration. "And the determination," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as if reliving the energy of that special child. Even being the smallest in the class, even facing daily mockery, Steph never gave up. Never. When other boys said he was too small to play basketball, he simply trained more. When they said his dreams were impossible, he dreamed higher. What's most impressive is how some people manage to transform adversity into fuel for growth from very early on. Joshua Miller, former youth basketball coach, had observed Steph during some informal practices and had always been impressed with his mental resistance. "I remember another incident," Sarah continued, "when Steph was on the playground practicing shots alone. A group of older boys came and started mocking him, saying he was wasting time because he would never be tall enough to play professional basketball. It was impossible not to feel the injustice of those words directed at a child who was just following his dreams with pure determination." Brian Garcia, who had been a student at the same school a few years later, remembered the stories that circulated about the small boy who never gave up. "Steph stopped shooting," Sarah continued, turned to the boys, and, with a calm that impressed me, said, "Maybe you're right about my size, but my dad taught me that God measures our hearts, not our height, and I believe my heart is big enough for any dream." How many times in life do you witness a child transform a moment of humiliation into a declaration of faith? Paul Martinez, local writer who documented inspiring community stories, felt he was hearing something that deserved to be preserved for future generations. But perhaps the moment that most revealed Steph's exceptional character, Sarah said, preparing to share something that clearly touched her in a very special way, was when he came to me after a particularly difficult day of bullying and asked me a question that broke my heart and simultaneously filled me with admiration. It was possible to perceive that Sarah was preparing to reveal something that had shaped her understanding of childhood faith and spiritual resilience. Kenneth Jones, veteran school counselor, leaned forward, recognizing that he was about to hear something deeply significant. Steph had been pushed in the hallway by bigger boys, Sarah revealed, his books scattered. Across the floor, his confidence visibly shaken. When everyone left, he came to my room and asked me the most vulnerable question a child can ask. Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest lessons about faith arise when a child questions whether they are worthy of divine love in the moments when they most need confirmation. Sarah took a deep breath, preparing to share words that carried 3 decades of emotional weight. He asked me. Sarah paused, as if the words were too precious to be wasted. Something that would forever change my understanding of how children process suffering and faith. And that question will break your hearts the same way it broke mine that day. No one could imagine that this moment would be the turning point. Sarah Mitchell took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she touched a letter that Steph had written to her in 1995, a letter she had kept as treasure for 3 decades. It was possible to perceive that she was preparing to share something that had marked her so deeply that it could still make her cry after all these years. "It was a December afternoon," she began, her voice laden with an emotion that made the entire environment fall completely silent. Steph had had a particularly difficult day. Besides the usual bullying, he had made some mistakes on a math test. Simple mistakes, the kind any 10-year-old child would make. Have you ever wondered how some children carry emotional weights that even adults can't process adequately? Thomas Anderson, child psychologist who had specialized in academic pressure in children, leaned forward, recognizing the signs of something deeply significant. "When all the other students left," Sarah continued, "Steph stayed in the room, arranging books in an almost obsessive way, as if trying to organize something much deeper than just school materials. I could see there were tears in his eyes." Gregory Taylor, former principal who had witnessed many intimate conversations between educators and students, remembered well those delicate moments where a child's true struggles finally emerged to the surface. "I approached him gently," Sarah revealed, "and asked if he was okay. Steph looked at me with those big, vulnerable eyes, and for a moment I thought he would just say he was fine, as he always did. But then, something that touches deeply is when we witness the exact moment when a child decides to completely trust an adult with their most intimate pains." Nicholas White, retired school counselor, knew exactly how precious and fragile those moments were. "Then he asked me the question that changed my life forever," Sarah said, and now tears rolled freely down her face. "He asked me, 'Teacher Sarah, if I make too many mistakes at school, does God still love me?' 10 years old, and he was questioning whether he was worthy of divine love because of academic errors." The impact of those words was devastating. How is it possible for such a small child to already carry the weight of feeling they need to earn God's love? Jonathan Harris, pastor who had worked with children for decades, felt a lump in his throat, recognizing the depth of that spiritual insecurity. "I knelt to his eye level," Sarah continued, her voice now trembling with emotion, "and asked why he thought God might stop loving him. And his answer haunts me to this day." Naturally, this leads us to the moment that revealed such pure vulnerability that it touched the heart of anyone who had ever struggled with the feeling of not being enough. Samuel Clark, theologian specialized in spiritual development, prepared to hear something he knew would mark him deeply. "Steph told me," Sarah revealed, he said, "because everyone always expects me to be perfect. My dad is a famous player, so everyone expects me to be incredible at basketball. Teachers expect me to be the best student. Classmates expect me to be strong when they hurt me. And if I can't be perfect for people, how can I be good enough for God?" What would you feel if a 10-year-old child articulated existential pressure that most adults struggle to express? Benjamin Lewis, psychologist who studied perfectionism in children, was clearly touched by the painful maturity of that confession. "But then," Sarah continued, Steph told me something that revealed the true depth of his character. He said, "Teacher Sarah, I cry sometimes because I'm so afraid of disappointing everyone. I don't want my dad to think I wasted his genes. I don't want my mom to think she failed raising me. I don't want God to think I wasted the talents he gave me." It was impossible not to feel that this child was carrying responsibilities that even adults shouldn't bear. Timothy Walker, educator who had worked with children of professional athletes, recognized well the unique pressure these children faced. "I held his hands," Sarah said, "and tried to explain that God's love doesn't depend on our performance. But do you know what Steph told me then? He said something that proved his faith was deeper than his fears. What's most impressive is how some children manage to find spiritual wisdom even in the midst of their greatest insecurities. David Rodriguez, children's minister who had worked with hundreds of families, leaned closer, knowing he was about to hear something profound. "Steph told me, 'Teacher Sarah, I know God loves me because when I pray for Jimmy, for Marcus, for all the boys who hurt me, I feel peace in my heart. And I think that peace is God showing me how he feels when he looks at all people, even those who are mean.'" How many times in life do you find someone who transforms their own pain into compassion for others? Michael Thompson, writer who documented stories of forgiveness, felt he was hearing something that challenged his understanding of spiritual maturity in children. "I asked him how he managed to pray for children who hurt him," Sarah continued, "and Steph gave me an answer I could never forget. He said, 'My dad taught me that when Jesus was on the cross, he prayed for the soldiers who hurt him. If Jesus could do that, maybe I can too.'" Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest demonstrations of faith happen when a 10-year-old child chooses to follow Christ's example even while suffering. Marcus Williams, theologian specialized in Christology, was visibly moved by the depth of that theological application. "But then Steph told me something that made me realize I was in the presence of something very special," Sarah said, preparing to reveal the moment that had defined her understanding of that boy's exceptional character. "He told me that every night, before sleeping, he prayed for each child who had been cruel to him that day. Not just a quick prayer, but specific prayers. He prayed for Jimmy to stop feeling angry inside. He prayed for Marcus to find true friends. He prayed for all the boys who laughed at him to discover something that would make them truly happy." How is it possible for a child who regularly suffers bullying to find compassion to pray specifically for their aggressors? Ashley Williams, counselor who worked with bullying victims, had never encountered a case of such extraordinary spiritual resilience. "And when I asked how he managed to do that," Sarah revealed, "Steph gave me the most beautiful answer I've ever heard from a child. He said, 'Teacher Sarah, Jesus said we should love our enemies. I think he said that not to protect them, but to protect our heart from getting filled with anger.' It was possible to perceive that this wisdom from a 10-year-old child was touching universal wounds and hopes about forgiveness and spiritual growth." Andrea Hall, minister who had preached about forgiveness for decades, recognized in Steph's words an understanding that rivaled that of experienced theologians. But perhaps the moment that most revealed Steph's exceptional depth, Sarah said, preparing to share something that clearly represented the peak of her memories of that special boy, was when he confessed his greatest fear to me. Melissa Young, psychologist specialized in childhood anxiety, prepared to hear something she knew would touch her deeply, recognizing she was about to understand the most intimate layers of that extraordinary child's emotional experience. "Steph told me," Sarah revealed, her voice now laden with a reverence that made the entire environment fall completely silent. He told me, "Teacher Sarah, my greatest fear isn't that I'll never be tall enough to play basketball. My greatest fear is that I'll grow up and forget how important it is to be kind. Because I see adults who were kind children, and now they're hard. And I'm afraid life will make me forget that being good is more important than being big. Great things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest revelations about character happen when a child expresses wisdom that transcends their age and touches the essence of what it means to remain human in a world that often pressures us to harden our hearts." It was impossible not to perceive that this confession from a 10-year-old child carried a depth that challenged any conventional understanding of emotional and spiritual development. Amy Robinson, educator who had worked with gifted children, recognized in Steph a combination of emotional intelligence and spiritual wisdom that she rarely saw even in adults. And it was at that moment, Sarah said, her voice now laden with a gratitude that 3 decades couldn't diminish, that I knew I wasn't just educating a special child. I was having the privilege of witnessing how God prepares someone who would one day change the world, not just with talent, but with character. And it was then that the truth finally came to light. Sarah Mitchell delicately held a small piece of paper yellowed by time, a drawing that Steph had made for her in May of 1995, shortly before the end of the school year. It was possible to perceive that this simple piece of paper carried memories she had kept as sacred treasure for 3 decades. "You know," she began, her voice now laden with a mixture of nostalgia and admiration that only truly dedicated educators can express. "Throughout the entire school year, Steph often stayed after class to help me organize the room, and in these intimate moments, he shared dreams that made me realize I was in the presence of something very special." Have you ever wondered what it's like to hear a 10-year-old child articulate dreams that reveal emotional maturity rivaling that of adults? Kimberly King, social worker who had worked with families for decades, leaned forward, recognizing she was about to hear something that would deeply touch anyone who had ever loved their family. "One day," Sarah continued, "Steph was helping me erase the board when he suddenly stopped and told me, 'Teacher Sarah, I have a dream that's bigger than playing basketball.' When I asked what it was, he gave me an answer that made me cry right then and there." Katie Thompson, retired nurse who had cared for many families over the years, felt a familiar tightness in her chest. How is it possible for some children to carry so much family love that it becomes the driving force of all their dreams? "Steph told me," Sarah revealed, tears already glistening in her eyes. "He told me, 'Teacher Sarah, I want to be famous in basketball so I can buy a really big and beautiful house for my grandma. She always took care of our whole family, and now that she's older, I want to take care of her.'" The impact of those words was immediate and overwhelming. It was impossible not to feel how a 10-year-old child already understood gratitude and family responsibility in a way many adults never learn. Lauren Miller, geriatrician who worked with elderly people, was visibly moved by the purity of that intergenerational love. "But it wasn't just about Grandma," Sarah continued. "Steph had detailed plans to care for his entire family. He told me, 'When I grow up and earn enough money, I'm going to buy a house for my parents too. A house without a mortgage, so they never have to worry about money again.'" Something that touches deeply is when a child demonstrates understanding about financial security that transcends their age, not out of greed, but out of pure love. Megan Garcia, financial counselor who had helped many families, recognized in Sarah's description a type of motivation she rarely saw even in adult clients. I asked Steph why this was so important to him, Sarah revealed, and his answer showed me a depth of gratitude that haunts me to this day. He said, "Teacher Sarah, my dad works very hard to take care of us. Sometimes I see him tired, but he never complains. I want him to stop worrying and just be happy." Naturally, this leads us to the moment that revealed the true magnitude of that special child's heart. Christina Lopez, family therapist who had worked with family dynamics for years, was clearly touched by the emotional maturity demonstrated by that child. "And then Steph told me something," Sarah said, "that proved his dreams weren't just about his family. They were about using the talents God had given him to touch as many lives as possible." What's most impressive is how some children manage to understand purpose and social responsibility from very early on. Rebecca White, founder of a local charitable organization, prepared to hear something she knew would inspire her deeply. "Steph told me, 'Teacher Sarah, I believe God gave me basketball talent for a reason, not just for me to be famous or win trophies. I think He wants me to use this talent to help other people who are like me, small, different, who others say will never make it.'" How is it possible for a 10-year-old child to already understand that talent comes with social responsibility? Danielle Harris, educator who had worked with youth mentoring programs, was visibly moved by the clarity of purpose demonstrated by that child. "But perhaps the most beautiful thing," Sarah continued, "was when Steph explained how he planned to use his future fame. He said, 'I want to show other small children that they can dream big. I want them to see that being different isn't bad, it's special. And I want to use all the money I earn to build places where children like me can play basketball without anyone making fun of them.'" It was possible to perceive that this vision from a 10-year-old child carried wisdom about social impact that rivaled that of experienced philanthropic leaders. Catherine Clark, director of a foundation for at-risk youth, recognized in Sarah's description a type of systematic compassion rarely seen in adults. "And do you know what moment touched me most?" Sarah asked, preparing to share something that clearly represented the apex of her memories of that extraordinary boy. Brittany Lewis, journalist who documented inspiring community stories, leaned closer, knowing she was about to hear something that deserved to be preserved for future generations. "It was the last day of class," Sarah revealed, "and Steph had brought a gift for me, not something bought, but something made with his own hands. It was a drawing of him playing basketball, but not in a stadium, full of people. He had drawn himself playing on a simple playground, surrounded by children of all ages and sizes, all smiling. Great things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest revelations about character happen when a child expresses their dreams through pure and sincere art." Vanessa Walker, art teacher who had worked with children's creative expression, was touched by the symbolism of that image. "On the back of the drawing," Sarah continued, "Steph had written a message that I have read every day for the past 30 years. He wrote, 'To Teacher Sarah, who always believed my heart was big enough for any dream. When I'm famous, I'll remember that you taught me being kind is more important than winning. Thank you for showing me that God loves me just the way I am.'" What would you feel if a 10-year-old child gave you a gift that carried decades of deep meaning? Andrea Hall, who had worked as a youth mentor, felt tears rolling down her face as she imagined the purity of that childlike gratitude. "But the part that really made me cry," Sarah said, was the last line of the message. Steph had written, "One day, when I help other children like you helped me, They'll know there are people in the world who believe in small dreams that grow to change everything. It was impossible not to perceive that this 10-year-old child had articulated a life philosophy that would take decades for most people to develop. Melissa Young, personal development coach, recognized in Steph's wisdom principles she tried to teach experienced executives. "And do you know what impresses me most, after all these years?" Sarah asked, her voice now laden with admiration that 3 decades couldn't diminish. "It's that Steph fulfilled every promise he made in those days. He took care of his family. He used his talents to inspire children around the world. He proved that kindness can coexist with greatness." How many times in life do you witness someone who not only dreams big, but has the integrity to fulfill every promise made when they were still a child? Amy Robinson, biographer who had studied stories of inspiring leaders, was clearly touched by the consistency of character demonstrated over decades. "When I see Steph today," Sarah continued, "playing in front of millions of people, winning championships, inspiring generations, I don't just see a successful athlete. I see that 10-year-old boy who shared his snack every day, who prayed for those who hurt him, who dreamed of using his talents to elevate others." Nicole Martinez, retired educator who had followed Steph's career over the years, nodded with deep recognition. How is it possible for a child to maintain the purity of their heart even when reaching the highest peaks of worldwide success? "And perhaps the most beautiful lesson," Sarah said, preparing for the closing she had rehearsed in her heart for 3 decades, "is that great things really do happen when no one is looking." That small boy who was mocked on the playground, who cried in silence, who felt inadequate for his own dreams, he never stopped believing that kindness is more powerful than greatness. Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest transformations happen when someone has enough courage to keep kindness intact while conquering the world, proving it's possible to be simultaneously humble and extraordinary. "If I could give advice to any child who feels too small for their dreams," Sarah concluded, "I would say, be like Steph. Be kind when the world is cruel. Be generous when others are selfish. Pray for those who hurt you. Dream not just about what you want to achieve, but about how many lives you want to touch. Because in the end, what really matters isn't how high you reached, but how many people you lifted along the way." It was possible to perceive that those words carried not only the wisdom of an experienced educator, but also the testimony of someone who had had the privilege of shaping one of the most special souls of her generation. "And to Steph," Sarah said, looking directly at the camera as if he could hear her through 3 decades, "if you're hearing this, you fulfilled every promise you made to that teacher in 1995. You became exactly the man that boy dreamed of being. And I'm still proud to have been your teacher." How is it possible for some stories to have the power to touch the human heart so deeply that they become part of our own journey? Perhaps because, deep down, we all need to believe that kindness can coexist with greatness, that dreams can come true without sacrificing humanity, and that the special child that exists within each of us never needs to die, no matter how high we fly.